Welcome back to the Craftsman Online Podcast. I'm your host, Right Worshipful Brother Michael Arce. We are the only Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York, and a special edition as we are also streaming the recording of this conversation, which is featuring some heavy hitters. We have some of our famous faces returning on the podcast as guests, and also some new friends as we introduce you to our panel to discuss what the founders meant when it comes to the pursuit of happiness. We'll be talking with Dr. Tread Cross, who's also a brother. He serves as the Assistant Vice President of Principal Innovation at Arizona State University. He's the past master of the Arizona Lodge of Research. His work focuses on leadership, behavioral psychology, and organizational ethics. He also collaborated with the National Constitution Center to develop the educational course that we'll be talking about tonight that focuses on character and the founding of America. We're welcoming back Right Worshipful Brother Lee Justo, who serves as the past Deputy Grand Historian of the Grand Lodge of New York, and he's the co-chair of our America 250 committee. He's also the current Worshipful Master of Huguenot Lodge number 46 in Mount Kisco, New York. He produces the Secret History of Huguenot Lodge video series on YouTube, which I highly recommend. It documents our early New York Masonic history and the Revolutionary War. First timer, as we welcome him to the Craftsman Online Podcast, is Jeffrey Rosen. He's the CEO Emeritus of the National Constitution Center, professor of law at the George Washington University Law School. He's written several books on the United States Constitution, our founders, including The Pursuit of Happiness, which this course has been based on, and also hosts the We the People podcast. And finally, a returning champion, Brother Chris Ruli, who's a historian and author who studies early American fraternalism and its impact on politics and society. He's written several books on Washington, D.C. Masonry, the history, and our American Revolution. He currently serves as the director of the Library, Museum, and Archives of the Scottish Rite Southern Masonic Jurisdiction in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, welcome to the panel.
Thanks for having us.
Jeffrey Rosen, we're kind of gathered here tonight to talk about your book, What the Founders Meant by the Pursuit of Happiness. And you teamed up with Arizona State University to create this free online course. I think the obvious question that our listener and viewer is going to be asking is, what drew you to this topic? And then how did you develop this course?
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here and really looking forward to the conversation. What drew me to the topic was unexpectedly noticing that both Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson had chosen as their motto for the pursuit of happiness a quotation from a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. And Franklin's version, and it's important, I guess, to say up front that Franklin was a Mason, Franklin's version was, without virtue, happiness cannot be. And Jefferson had a longer quotation. So I thought I should read the Cicero book, but what else to read? And then I found this amazing reading list that Jefferson would give to anyone who asked him how to be educated, kids who are going to law school or friends who are building a library. It's remarkable for the scope and the schedule. The scope includes literature, politics, history, science. My eye was caught by the section called Moral Philosophy, which began with Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, and then Seneca's letters, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, Epictetus, and then Enlightenment moral philosophers like Locke, Hutcheson, Hume, and Bolingbroke. And what struck me about the list is I hadn't read any of the books on it, so I thought I should, but I was also daunted and kind of inspired by Jefferson's schedule. He says you've got to get up every morning 2 hours before dawn, read moral philosophy for 2 hours, watch the sunrise, then you can read political philosophy and history while you're still fresh, then lunch, then scientific topics in the afternoon, then dinner, then Shakespeare and poetry for mild amusement, and then to bed 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I don't know what got into me. It was COVID. We had more time. And I tried a version of the schedule, not the whole thing, but I got up early before dawn, read moral philosophy for an hour or two, watched the sunrise, which remains the most beautiful experience that you can have any day. And what I learned from this year of deep reading changed my life and changed my understanding of how the founders understood the pursuit of happiness. And to sum it up briefly, for the founders, happiness meant not feeling good, but being good, not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. And by virtue, they meant self-improvement, character improvement, self-mastery, using your powers of reason to moderate your unreasonable passions and emotions so you can achieve the calm tranquility that allows you to serve others and also connect to the divine. So that's what I learned. It was an incredibly satisfying project. I'm so excited to talk about it with all of you tonight.
I think for most Americans, maybe the most interaction we have with the founding fathers right now is when we literally reach into our wallets or our pockets to pay with coins or dollars, or we see them, if you're at a DC Nationals game running in the outfield. We don't have that constant connection with them. And what moved me about this course was really the focus on citizenship, and it really got into character, and it came back to the idea of the single person, the individual's role in this society. And I wanted to get the take of Jeffrey and Ted on this, and how you've talked about the founders defining happiness as kind of this moral position, and it's a different definition of how you want to talk about changing our role as a citizen in a civic and productive society.
Yeah, my sort of introduction to what Jeffrey's been talking about was through his book, of course, but also less academically through my lived experience. I remember my wife one night, we're both scrolling on our phones, and she slams down her phone and looks at me and says, "Happiness is overrated." And I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" Especially since I, lead studies on character and happiness and flourishing at ASU. And we've been married long enough that I waited to hear what her response was before reacting. And she said, I see all this fake happiness online. Everybody is pretending to be happy. There's this conspicuous consumption that may or may not be real. And it really dawned on me that what Jeffrey's trying to get across to us moderns, is that happiness is not about seeking that immediate pleasure and gratification, about being a good person. And so at Arizona State University, we have this program called Principled Innovation, which is our version of character education, which is really centered on helping people identify their own values and live into them. And we look at 4 different areas: moral, civic, intellectual, and performance. We believe that higher education isn't just about making a good living, but also learning to live a good life. And I think that's one of the things that the founders were focused on. And we've drifted, not, surprisingly, away from that kind of a definition.
But there's Chris and Lee. I didn't want to leave you out of this. I talked about the America 250 celebrations that we've all been witnessing throughout the summer, not only on the national stage, but also across our jurisdictions and even in our local communities. Was there a particular event or moment that maybe you witnessed this summer that you're going to carry with you for years to come?
I would say that we did the rededication of the Nicholas Herkimer Monument up in Little Falls, New York. And the coming together of brotherhood to make this event happen is significant. We had the Oriskany Masonic War veterans. They drove over there to do the color guard, and they played a big part in it. He organized the photographs. So I would say that was like the one aspect that stood out to me, was the brotherhood that I experienced in putting that event on.
I think there have been a number of different activities and events going on throughout the United States, certainly with Masonic organizations and Grand Lodges and other bodies. I think one of the things that struck me was that we often look back at, as Dr. Rosen mentioned in his introduction, sort of about these individual Masons, right? These Masons like Franklin and Washington. I think it's important for our listeners and for those who are participating in this course to understand the context of the time, right? I hope others will agree with me. I think there was a general interest in, humility, thrift, individual industry, supporting the sort of local community, right? Because these individual colonies were not necessarily these unified states that we have today. That didn't necessarily happen until the 19th century. And so to celebrate these individuals, as we've done in the last couple months as part of the 250th years celebrations, to me, you got to look at what was Franklin like, what was Jefferson like. They valued these certain characteristics. Now, I wonder, and probably Dr. Rosen, I wonder what your thoughts are on this, and Dr. Cross on this as well, as has technology served as an inhibitor of this type of virtue? Are we losing something from this virtue because of technology, or is that just an easy excuse, a scapegoat, because we've lost these types of virtues or characteristics?
Well, that's a great question. And the short answer is yes, but let's think our way up to it. So for the founders, personal self-government is necessary for political self-government. In other words, we can't be good citizens unless we're good people. And unless we can master ourselves and improve our character, we won't be able to resist descending into faction, which Madison defines as any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. And Madison thought that religious disputes were among the greatest sources of faction, which is why his main crusade as a young man was to join Jefferson in crusading against the Anglican establishment in Virginia. And he defended absolute freedom of conscience because he said the opinions of men, being dependent on evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot be controlled by others. And that's why freedom of conscience is an unalienable right. I can't give anyone the power to control my thoughts because they're the product of reason and persuasion, not force or violence. It's very similar to what I understand the original mission statement of the Masons to be, which is really to converge on the religious principles that all people agree in, setting aside sectarian differences, welcoming all sects and backgrounds, to focus on the common moral principles. And in that sense, rejecting the idea of state preference for any one religion and achieving union in that way. And really, there was a connection between virtue and union. Now, Madison thought that two things would help union. First, the large size of America would make it hard for factions to mobilize, and by the time they did, they would get tired and go home. And he also thought that a new technology, namely the broadside press, would allow citizens to read complicated arguments like the Federalist Papers in newspapers, discuss them with their representatives, and with the help of an enlightened class of journalists and statesmen he called the literati, a kind of Atlantic magazine editorial board, he thought that reason would slowly diffuse across the land. Now, it's obvious how far we've come from that, and it's also obvious how technology is the antithesis of Madison's hopes, and in so many ways represents Madison's nightmare. First, the instant speed of technology obviates the benefits of size. There's no time for slow, cooling deliberation in a time of instant communication. But more significantly, the technology polarizes us into filter bubbles and echo chambers. The algorithms give us more versions of what we're already inclined to consume. And as a result, political and religious faction of the kind the founders and the Masons were determined to overcome is more powerful than ever, and we're more polarized than at any time since the Civil War. The main way that technology has threatened the founders' vision is a point that Ted made at the beginning when he's sort of putting down his phone at the dinner table. It's that we're also addicted to our devices, that people have stopped reading. I had gotten out of the habit of reading books just for the sake of learning rather than for some deadline or for some work purpose. And the founders thought that unless we read primary texts, we couldn't think for ourselves and speak as we think, as Tacitus said. And that's why freedom of conscience, and I guess Masonry as well, were crucial, because people could get together and in discussion with each other make up their own minds about religious and political topics rather than just blindly following a leader or a faction. So that's a long way of saying that we're really challenged by technology. And that's why it's so important to have groups like the Masons where people can get together face to face, talk about values, read, and learn together. That's the definition of the pursuit of happiness.
Well, I appreciate that endorsement wholeheartedly. I do value that about Freemasonry. We talk about like-minded men getting together, a bond of brotherhood, united under, the canopy of heaven, this mystic tie that we're all brought together by. But you touched on one thing. There's a challenge with technology. I think the other challenge is, and quite frankly, we find this also in Freemasonry in our ritual, and that it's very arcane, and the old English that's kind of stewed into it is that nobody talks like this anymore. And I think this is a perfect question for all four of you, because you're nodding your heads. You all have that researcher and historian and archivist background. Is that how do you take these words that have significant meaning of English that was 250 years ago and share it with a modern American who has the attention span, honestly, of a gnat?
Freemasonry presents some common goods that we all agree on that is very helpful for us to get together. First, we're presented with the seven liberal arts and sciences, and that we should study those. And then we're taught about the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 heavenly virtues. But I think what we miss is not just going through that ritual, but then discussing afterwards and with our new brothers, what does that actually mean? Why are we so adamant about the liberal arts and sciences? Why are we so adamant about these cardinal virtues? What does prudence actually mean? It doesn't mean to be incredulous. It means to be wise, for instance, and translating those into modern, I think, examples and instances.
Yeah, Michael, I think there is this tension, I suspect, or at least a tension in the past, where there's a perception that Freemasonry is, quote unquote, a secret society. It has this sort of perception in modern terms. That perception is not existent in late 18th century, even in the 19th century. We don't see it as a secret society. We saw it as a public institution which engaged with its members. It helped, its members. If you look at the membership rolls, look at the petition fees, look at the mechanics of joining a lodge, a farmer could not necessarily join a lodge because it couldn't afford the petition or the fees. And so who were these individuals? These were leaders of local towns. These were administrators, civil servants. They famously, certain founding fathers. And so what were they interested in? They were interested in engaging in the public. They supported local charities. They marched in processions and public events. They engaged with the public. And so there is a little bit of a dichotomy where Masons join often. They join because, well, I'm interested in learning and improving myself. How does one do that? Well, once you go through that initiatic process, there is sort of a slight obligation to go out into the community and to engage. How do you do that? You have to be an educated person. As Dr. Rosen said, and as others have mentioned, you have to engage in reading, writing, a study and appreciation of the liberal arts and sciences. Explain the liberal arts and sciences to a regular farmer, to 98% of the population in the 1700s, in late 1700s in the colonies. That is a foreign concept. Very few of those individuals knew what the liberal arts and sciences were. And so for the fraternity initially, I would argue, had this air of it served a higher class, a state of colonials. At the turn, once the United States formed, once we formed a constitution, once we started to meld together into the United States, it started to open itself up, become more egalitarian, and those principles, along with the principles of the founding fathers, started to disseminate. We started to read the autobiographies of Benjamin Franklin. We started to look back. Right, American history didn't start in 1700. Bancroft produced, the history of the American United States in 1850s. So we started to look retrospectively at our own formation, and that's where I think we started to see these values really populate.
I want to reach out to Lee on a quick one because he has an interesting YouTube series where he's literally walking around in New York City, and you just see all of these people, millions every day, walking by these historical points of American history that they're just being forgotten. And it's simple things like recently in a video you were walking around Central Park and things like the wonderful obelisk that is there. Why do you have this passion? What is the need you feel to tell this story, to remind people of this is who we are and this is where we came from, and most importantly, like, this is what we stand for?
I started studying it because I really wanted to understand the connection between Freemasonry and our founding. And it was quite a shock to learn that the lodge that I am master of was partially loyalist and partially patriot, but they all came together after the war. And they were all founders of Westchester County, New York. Pretty much everyone in my lodge played a major role. And multiple brothers in the lodge were very instrumental in getting public education started in Westchester County. And we had a public library in both Westchester County and the Bronx. It was all one county, but we had 2 branches. So there was a clear push from the brothers to really get the average person educated. And I think that ties into our ritual. I mean, to me, the degrees are just the ultimate challenge to improve yourself.
So, Jeffrey, we got to talk about, if we're going to do a Masonic podcast or talk about the beginning of America, we wouldn't be doing our job here if we didn't mention George Washington, the most famous American and American Freemason of all. And it didn't take very long getting into the Pursuit of Happiness module, the course that's available at Arizona State University, to stumble upon George Washington. Particularly, like, what made him different, his character and the way that he presented and also carried himself.
Absolutely. And the goal of the course and the book is to use the founders as examples to inspire people to improve their character. That's the way people have been inspired throughout history, and there's no one more inspiring than the great George Washington. And the moment that we chose to exemplify his lifelong struggle over his passions, because he had a hot temper and he struggled throughout his life to control it. And he resolved to do that based on his youthful reading in Seneca in particular and other Stoic philosophers who advised him to master himself, to lose no time, and to never lose his temper in public. He was only seen to do it twice. Once on the battlefield when someone disobeyed his orders, and once when the Senate disrespected him and he stormed out. But his perhaps his greatest moment was at Newburgh in 1783, and rebellion is in the air. It's the end of the war. The soldiers still can't get paid because the Continental Congress can't get its act together enough to force the states to pay their requisitions, and the soldiers are getting restless. Washington could have turned himself into a military dictator if he'd wanted to, but he chose the opposite. He mounted a wooden stage called the Temple of Virtue, and he appealed for patience and prudence and temperance and courage, the classical virtues, and said to the soldiers if they could just have the patience to wait, he would ensure that they were paid. And then famously, he took a letter out of his pocket and struggled to read it, and put on his reading glasses and said, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I've grown old in your service, and now I've grown almost blind." And the soldiers wept because they'd never seen him confess humility before. And it was at that moment of self-abnegation that Washington was greatest, just as one of his other greatest moments, of course, was voluntarily stepping down from the presidency and returning to his farm. As King George said, if Washington does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. So Washington was not the most scholarly founder or the most brilliant or the best read, but he was universally acknowledged as being the most virtuous and having the strongest character. And for that reason, his countrymen viewed him as the greatest American.
And I just want to point out that when we talk about virtue, and we talked about the cardinal virtues, about Washington being virtuous, what the Greeks meant by that was excellent. Something was virtuous doesn't mean it was perfect or without sin or something like this that we sort of transpose onto it in modern times. It was about being excellent and fit for purpose. A pair of scissors can be excellent if it cuts really well. And also an associated value I think we need today is this idea of practical wisdom or phronesis that the ancient Greeks talk about a lot too, is this know-how of combining all these virtues that you've lived in your life and then knowing how to apply them in a given situation rather than relying on hard and fast rules or dogmas or, as we mentioned before, certain religious doctrines that may or may not work in a given instance.
I think the reverence for George Washington is sort of aspirational in many senses. I think we aspire to become George Washington. We aspire, it's sort of a secular worship, right? It's not necessarily a divine worship, but many people, and we manifest this through books and through a city, that we sort of place him on a pillar of respect and virtue. Also, it's not necessarily this thing that once you have it, it is continuous. It is a constantly developing thing. You must till the fields. You must continue to work on virtue. So I think that it sort of speaks to the contemporary time where it was seen as this was something that you are working towards betterment. You are working towards higher virtues. You're working towards a goal of self-reliance, of independence, of support, of being a stable and a respected individual. We see them in times of danger where we all come together, that sort of sense of American patriotism after 9/11, where we all sort of came together to aspire to try to do something or fix something. And it comes through these national events after the Civil War, the World War II and World War I. And I think that's where virtues are brought up the most, right? During these emergency moments in American history where we need to remind ourselves, why are we doing these and why these things are so important. We see these moments cross time, and I'm not necessarily sure if there's something coming up that will simulate that, but I think that we have to be cognizant that we often talk about these virtues or lack of virtues in points of American history where policies and politics shift.
Surge in fraternalism after every major conflict. So I wonder if it's like a chicken and egg kind of thing where one leads to another, where you're faced with such dire consequences, and afterwards people come together. Conflicts. We saw it after World War One, after World War II, obviously after the Civil War and the American Revolution. And whether it's a chicken or egg thing, maybe those types of traumatic events bring people back to what's really important.
Jeffrey, not a Freemason. Trust me, we're going to work on that. That's the goal of the podcast and our mission here. But one of the questions that we deal with a lot when there's an interested gentleman who's, seeking to join a lodge or visit a lodge is one of the questions that they might ask is, hey, I heard the founding fathers were Freemasons. One of the things that personally drew me to Freemasonry was not so much the ritual or the legacy of the tradition of it, but the idea, and I think that this also gets to the point of your book and why the course is so powerful, is that larger question of what can I learn? How can I be better if these people were doing it? If this is what the founders, these great men were doing, by me being a part of this organization, what could I glean from it? What are people going to get from having an appreciation or studying or just spending time to reconnect with the origins of our American story?
It's so inspiring to recognize that the founders, for all of their greatness, were human, just like us. And they struggled every day, as we've been discussing, to live up to their own principles and frequently recognized when they failed, both about large failings and small. The largest failing, of course, is slavery. And it's important to recognize that the founders in that generation, at least, recognized that slavery was wicked and immoral and violated the Bible and natural law. Some of them, in their more candid moments, acknowledge their own hypocrisy. Patrick Henry said, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery violates the Bible, myself own slaves? I won't justify it. I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed. I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." I mean, just a remarkable confession of the fact that he liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up, even though he knew it was wicked and wrong. But even in smaller ways, it's inspiring and heartening, ultimately, to see the founders having just as hard a time of it as we do. There's that great moment when John and Abigail Adams meet and they decide to make a list of each other's faults, which is not a good dating strategy, but they get it from Pythagoras, who recommends a practice of self-accounting every day. And Abigail struggles because John is so famously vain, and she soft pedals it by saying, "Well, you're so brilliant, people might think you're intellectually intimidating." And he responds, "Well, you should practice the piano more and read more, plus you're pigeon-toed." And she shoots back without missing a beat, "I'll try to practice and read more, but a gentleman shouldn't comment on a lady's posture." And, to see that they are just like us, trying every day to live up to their ideals. And for me, in fact, seeing how their son, John Quincy Adams, tried and struggled, he put such huge expectations on himself because of his upbringing. He said, "If I only had more self-discipline, I might have ended war and slavery." I mean, he's really setting the bar high. But as it is, he felt he was wasting time, spending too much time at the theater, drinking too much Madeira, even as he's going on to greater and greater achievements. And ultimately, of course, after the his defeat as president, transforms himself into the greatest abolitionist among white people of his age. So that's why studying history is so important and inspiring, because you come to appreciate the complexities of it. There's nothing simple about history. It's not actually like Parson Weems's famous biography of George Washington and the cherry tree. There are failures, there are doubts, and yet there's always the pursuit and the obligation every day to try again, and the recognition that because it is a pursuit, you'll never be perfect as Jesus was perfect, but you can attempt to become a little more perfect every day. So that's why it's so humanizing and inspiring to study history.
Jeffrey, tell us a bit about Pythagoras and his. Um, you talk a bit about him in some of your lectures, and you mentioned that a lot of the philosophy that we get today, even through the Greeks, come from Pythagoras and his mystery school.
It's incredible how excited I was to learn for the first time that in addition to inventing the triangle and the harmonic system, as if that weren't enough, Pythagoras was also the founder of Greek moral philosophy, and in particular, the first philosopher who divided the soul into three parts: reason in the head, passion or desire, or rather passion or emotion in the heart, and desire in the stomach. And he said it's our job to moderate or modulate our unreasonable passions so we can achieve tranquility. And it was that three-part division of the soul that Plato popularized in his famous metaphor of the charioteer representing reason with two horses. One is noble and the other is appetitive. And he's trying to ensure that both of them are pointing in the same direction. Pythagoras, in addition to being a philosopher and a composer and a genius, was a spiritual leader on the Isle of Croton, and he taught by example. He accepted a small number of disciples who he enjoined to live ascetically and with great self-discipline. He was a rigorous vegetarian, with one exception. He had a very strong prohibition on eating beans, and no one quite understood where it came from. Once his disciples were being chased by an enemy, and the enemy caught up to them and said, I'll spare your life if you answer one question. Why is it that you don't eat beans? And the disciples said, I'd rather die than tell you, and bit off her tongue and perished. People disagree. Some thought it was because beans resemble fetuses and have the spirit of life in them. And there were other explanations as well. But it's very important to realize also that Pythagoras was a practical philosopher. He was the one who came up with the self-accounting system that Franklin later popularized. And in his golden verses, which are well worth reading, he recommends every night taking an account of your virtues and your failures and resolving to do better the next day. It was that Franklin turned into his famous system of 13 virtues, which are in the course. And Franklin, using the Pythagoras system, suggested that every night we focus on a different virtue and put an X mark next to the virtue where we've fallen short. Franklin tried it for a while, found it was incredibly depressing, and gave it up after, but he felt he was better for having tried. I should note here that the Pythagoras and Franklin system of self-accounting has been picked up by other faiths, and a friend and I in Washington, D.C., practice a version of it at the recommendation of our local rabbi, who suggested a system called Musar, which in Hebrew means character. And not knowing that this came from Franklin, we basically used Franklin's system, which a Hasidic rabbi translated into Hebrew in the 19th century. And we also tried it for a while and then gave it up because it's so depressing. But we got it from Pythagoras to Franklin to Rabbi Salanter to us. So all this is to say that it's just impossible to overstate the importance of Pythagoras' contributions, and he was where it all began.
As part of my sort of research into the local Masonic history in 1854, I found a nice little notice in the Alexandria Gazette that announced the finding of George Washington's hatchet that he used to cut down the cherry tree. So, in the spirit of these great myths of American history, I was wondering, are there any myths that perpetuate in terms of the field that you were talking about in virtue?
What a great question. I believe that the hatchet story was a myth. I know that it first emerged in Parson Weems, and he attributed it to some kind of aged lady, but it was never actually pinned down, and I think that it was debunked by historians who said, or at least that it was an unverifiable assertion. It was never quite pinned down. So there might have been a hatchet that was attributed to Washington, but wasn't actually his. There are many other stories like that of poorly sourced um, dramatic claims. And one that comes to mind is the claim that Alexander Hamilton exclaimed at a dinner party, "Your people, sir, is a great beast," which was supposed to stand for his love of monarchy and distrust of democracy. That first appeared in Henry Adams's History of the United States in the Jefferson administration, but Adams's source was a Federalist who claimed to have heard it at second or third remove and wasn't actually at the party, which is why the historian Stephen Knox has concluded that it's probably false as well. And of course, even more broadly, Jefferson's whole rap on Hamilton, that he was a monarchist who secretly was yearning to resurrect monarchism and Caesarism in America, may have been the greatest political conspiracy theory in American history, because Hamilton always insisted that he was certainly not for hereditary monarchy, and Jefferson used that to kind of define the whole Democratic Republican Party. So those are just two examples.
I would also add that there's this general myth we've been skirting around, which is that our founding fathers and mothers were so different than us. I think Jeffrey's pointed out their foibles, their shortcomings, their sins, and their problems, just like us, maybe more dramatically for their time. And secondly, going along with that is the myth that, that comes out of leadership theory of the great man theory, which is just simply not true. We are products of the communities that we live in. And so I think, Chris, you mentioned, how do we learn from this class and then bring it into our communities and be the salt of the earth, if you will? I think that Robert Putnam's great book, Bowling Alone, and now his retrospective film, Join or Die, which is almost exclusively focused on fraternalism, is the answer, which is, I am because we are, not because I am. It's because of the community that builds me. And so how do we be part of that community? How do we interact with each other? Aristotle famously says that pursuit of flourishing and character is something that you can never arrive at, like many of you have mentioned today, but it's something that is done in the polis, something that is done amongst the people in the city-state and community.
Yeah, one of the things that I, in working on one of my books, which covered the sort of history of cataloging Masonic legacy of the fraternity with the White House, one of the things that I found so striking is that if you pick whatever administration, you can sort of see how the administration views the fraternity or vice versa by how it's the president acts or engages with the fraternity. There's this really interesting story of the night that Taft realized that he was going to be president of the United States. The third question asked to him was, would he join a Masonic lodge now that he is president-elect? And he, skirted the question, but said something to the effect of, I wasn't necessarily interested in joining before or during the race, because I did not want the fraternity to see this as simply an attempt to gain curry favor. And we see these types of interactions with great men, FDR being a Mason, Truman being a Mason. I'm very fascinated about this relationship between American leaders, how they engaged with the fraternity, as well as did they ever use the fraternity as an example or as a guidepost. In most cases, they didn't. But in cases where they did, it was often attributed to George Washington. It was often attributed to Benjamin Franklin. It was attributed to this history of, well, I wanted to join because I wanted to continue this tradition of leaders who joined the fraternity. And to your point, Ted, about joining alone or bowling alone, and the sort of, I think there's a slight uptick of this discussion that's happening. You see it in the Washington Post and New York Times about the male loneliness issue or this social isolation issue. I wonder if the fraternity should engage more in the public and serve as an example to people to bring people together.
I would completely agree with you. And I think that that's been one of the things that's been pretty amazing this year with the America 250 celebration and the movement has been the opportunity for local lodges, grand jurisdictions. Our friends down at DC this summer did a fantastic job of not only showcasing some of the great architecture and buildings and sites with some of the galas and events that they hosted there, but joined a concert of other Grand Lodges, Philadelphia, or the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, the Grand Lodge of New York, with the many things that we did marking the America 250 with the return of Lafayette and all of the movement, and kind of the banner that we all choose to kind of carry as Freemasons. You kind of have to be a little bit of a nerd to appreciate Freemasonry, because American history is part of who we are. It's just weaved into our DNA. And to kind of pivot back to this course, that's what really drew this course to me when Ted first started talking about what the founders meant by happiness, the journey through virtue and character course with Arizona State University and the National Constitution Center. And it's a free course. The link to participate and check it out for yourself will be available in whatever and however you're consuming this discussion tonight. It'll be right there, but it's 12 modules. And yeah, it starts with George Washington and some of the founding fathers. You get Thomas Jefferson, you get Madison, you get Hamilton. It gets all the way up to a really interesting conversation or look between the dynamic between Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass that I thought was very kind of cool as like a capstone to close this out and kind of to bring this all home. Here we are in 2026, looking back and having that benefit of looking through the lens and seeing the lessons of what the people who came before us had intended and what we can learn from them. And again, I think the biggest thing you walk away from after taking this course, the 12 modules, is an appreciation for American history, but also kind of your role as a citizen. And Jeffrey and Ted, if we could kind of get back to that. And one of the main points you make is that, a republic requires citizens who have a character and strong character, and they need to show up. I'm curious, the word and the tones that you're looking for to inspire people to get back involved, to become re-engaged in their communities and their role in being an American citizen.
Well, just recognizing how central the founders thought that was to the survival of the republic is one thing we hope will inspire citizens. Many of us know the famous exchange with Benjamin Franklin and Mrs. Powell after the Constitutional Convention. What have you created, Dr. Franklin? A republic if you can keep it. But most of them really were not sure that citizens could keep the republic. George Washington himself was worried about the rise of faction and feared for the future of the Union. Hamilton feared the excesses of democracy, which he put in capital letters in one of his last letters before the duel. Jefferson correctly feared the fissure of the country over civil war and the slavery question, which he considered a wolf in the night. Only Madison was a little more optimistic because he expected less of the virtue of citizens. Remember, he was moving away from the classical vision into a more institutional idea that ambition could counteract ambition, and a variety of factions could cancel each other out. But now that we've been talking about the ways that all of the cooling mechanisms and speed bumps and roadblocks that he put into place are being challenged by technology, that only increases the duty, if we can use that word, and I think we do use it a lot in the course, of citizens to engage in the hard work of self-improvement which means not tweeting and Instagramming and liking and convincing yourself that, I think that's called slacktivism or something like that, that's political engagement. Just giving approval to your team is the opposite of thinking for yourself. And it just contributes to the negative polarization where each side is more determined to destroy and undermine the other side than actually to listen to them. Citizenship is hard work. It also takes more than voting. I mean, we're often told, exercise your duties as a citizen by voting. Well, that's important to vote, but it's not, doesn't free you of the need to really inform yourself deeply about the issues. All of it's online, so you can read the primary sources yourself, to be willing to vote against your party if you think that another candidate is more virtuous, and to take seriously the obligation to elect virtuous representatives. I mean, I know this, of course, sounds quaint today and almost unattainable, but the idea is that only virtuous citizens will elect virtuous representatives. And the point of virtuous representatives is to prevent us from enacting our immediate impulses and require us to take sober second thoughts that will take account of the interests of the entire United States rather than our own selfish immediate interests. That was the whole game for Madison. And he believed and hoped that these structures of constitutional deliberation would do the job. So we all know how challenged we are. It's no mystery that social media is polarizing us, and we read the statistics and we recognize that there's something wrong with the system. And that should be enough to get us back to the hard work of self-improvement. I'll end this thought by saying, for me, the big takeaway from the project of spending a year reading moral philosophy is to get me back in the habit of deep reading, which really is a habit and a practice. So my new rule, I'm not getting up 2 hours before dawn anymore, but my new rule is when I wake up, I have to read a book before I can browse or surf, for whatever, a half hour, an hour. And it really is life-changing. And it's tough. The flesh is weak. I'm always tempted to check my email, but then I think, now that I've become a virtue monger, I better do my reading or I'm going to, get in trouble. Either you learn something new, unrelated to what you're working on, or it's a great way of, continuing to write and learn. And I'm now in the middle of the third volume of this Founders Trilogy, The Pursuit of Union. And I really can't wait to get up every morning and read and learn. It's just so good to get out of my ego-based concerns and lose myself in history and then in trying to convey enthusiasm for it. So that's what I got. And I know Ted feels the same way, that our course is really designed to inspire citizens to get back and do the hard work of self-improvement and getting deeply involved in our communities and our nation.
We talk about this in Freemasonry. I'm going to paraphrase some of this. I know Ted and Lee and Chris are going to be like, oh, I know what he's talking about. We are charged to be an upright man and Mason. We're told to be a peaceful citizen, and that everyone should benefit from the kindness of our offices. Those are some of the principles that we learn in Freemasonry. I'm going to leave this question for the four of you. What's the single action that our listener, or in this case, our viewer, can take today to be a good, virtuous citizen? What can they start today?
I think that the first thing they can do is create time and space for reflection, and to reflect on what are my own personal values that I want to live up to. I teach a class to students called Life by Design. It's about designing their life just like you would design a product. And it's amazing to me how little students have actually thought about what values they want to live by. Sometimes we call them virtues, but what values do I want to live my life by? I think that's a great place to start. And yes, they're going to change over time, but start there.
Posterity, you will never know how much it cost the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make good use of it. If you do not, I shall repent in heaven that I ever took half the pains to preserve it.
Who said that?
That was John Adams in a letter to Abigail.
Brother Ruli.
I think the one recommendation that I had is, I find the study or to seek out original primary sources, primary documents. I think it's very important. I'm curious if any classmates or folks who attend the courses actually saw the Constitution, read it. It's not that long. The Declaration is an interesting object. It's an artifact of complaints, quite frankly, right? But we sort of focus on the first part of it. So I think a interest and a discipline about looking at primary sources, looking at the classics, looking at these original documents, and then forming an opinion based on those rather than the regurgitation of other people's opinions on this. Go to the original sources. Take a look at what Adams said to his wife, what George Washington said. His letters are available online. Many of these founding fathers materials you can find online. Take a look at what they said, how they said it, to whom they said these things, and I think you will find an appreciation of where these stories came from, where these topics originated, as well as how over time these became American constructs or American principles.
All right. And our honored guest, I know you mentioned reading every morning, so I'm adding that to my list of things to do to be virtuous, but a single action for our listener or viewer.
Well, the kind of reading that Chris Ruli just described, I completely agree that it's urgently important to read primary sources. And that's especially important in an age of AI, where you can get a synthesis of people's opinion at the touch of a button. It may be inaccurate, but even if it's not inaccurate, there's nothing that can get around the necessary work of reading people in their own language so that you can make up your own mind rather than having the machine give an opinion to you. And I think to do that, making this sort of deep reading of primary text a habit or a practice is important, setting aside some time every day, whether in the morning or some other time, even only 15 minutes or a half hour, where you're just going to reach out to read primary sources. And as Chris really suggested, we live in some ways in the most miraculous age in human history because all of these sources are free and online. It just blows my mind. When I was a young boy, I went with my mom to the Library of Congress in DC, the Thomas Jefferson building, which I think still is the most beautiful building in DC, perhaps next to the Mason Temple. And I was so filled with wonder at the thought of all the books in the world were in that one space. And now they're just they can be on my Kindle or my iPhone. All I need is the self-discipline to read them. So make it a practice, read primary sources, read different points of view. When a Supreme Court decision comes down, don't just read the summary, but click on the opinion, which you can get immediately, and take the time to read all of it, the majority opinion, the concurrences, and the dissents, and then make up your own mind. And you don't have to be a lawyer and you don't have to read every word, but I always challenge young kids to do this. I remember I did this once on an NCC Zoom class, and a kid put in the chat, "I'm Bill, I'm 12, I'm not sure I can read the dissents." And I said, "I know you can," and he did. So this is what our ancestors and forefathers and the founders did. Think of Abraham Lincoln in his cabin reading the Bible and Shakespeare. Think of Frederick Douglass, whose wicked master forbade him from learning how to read. And at that moment, he felt more shackled than any other time. So he went to the streets of Baltimore. He bought reading lessons with bread. And then he bought with bread this little book, The Columbian Orator, which had excerpts from the classics and a dialogue about slavery. And that totally transformed and changed his life. And if that little book, won at such hard price, could transform Douglass into the greatest orator of his time, surely we can take 15 minutes just to click on all the wondrous primary sources that are waiting for us and let the learning begin.
This has been a phenomenal episode. Thank you again to all of our guests, Brother Ted Cross, Brother Lee Justo, Brother Chris Ruli, and our new friend, Jeffrey Rosen. Thank you all for your time and for being a part of the Craftsman Online podcast. I wish Jeffrey and Ted the best and continued success with your course with Arizona State University and the National Constitution Center.
Thank you so much.